In my previous SD Quattro video, I mainly talked about the good. I did that because the camera is fantastic. For me, and the way I shoot. But I'm not you, and you probably do things differently and have different priorities when shooting than I do. And that's part of what makes photography art, everyone doing their own things their own way and figuring out ways to capture spectacular images. First off, if you haven't seen the first video, watch that one before this one. It gives a lot of context. Second off, this video is going to be wordy and at times technical. It's basically an essay. Rather than taking video of the camera itself or me sitting in front of a camera talking to it, I'll be showing the results I've been able to achieve with this camera over the years that I've had it. So this will be a big wordy essay with pictures that will usually not be entirely relevant to what is being said at the time they come up, but they are relevant to the whole thing because at the end of the day, the only thing that matters about a camera is the result you are able to get with it. It doesn't matter what brand it is or how much it costs or what special technology it uses. What matters is that you like the way it renders things and that its function is conducive with your way of working. Which, oversimplifying a bit, the combination of those two things is what gets you your results. So, is the SD Quattro appropriate for you? Short answer is probably not. But you likely aren't here for the short answer, and that short answer is unsatisfying, is at the end of practically every review for the SDQ, and frankly, it sucks. It's a garbage cop-out answer to a complicated question. So, the very long answer. Notice how I said the word appropriate in that question. Like any other tool, it works well for some and not as well for others. It can also be learned despite having a sort of learning cliff compared to other cameras. Personally, I think overcoming this learning cliff is well worthwhile. Now, in saying this, the Quattro isn't for a particular club of people. Being the type of person that it's for doesn't make them any better than anyone else. People obviously get exceptional results with more regular cameras, often because of advanced features not directly linked to image quality, which is the Quattro's main priority. And that's a great thing. I just want to go over my experience with it to let people know its ups and downs beyond what the reviews that spend a few days with it have to say. Also, I want to know some things, if you have the time. I'm going to let you know my thoughts after using it for years and ask if it would work for you or not. And it'd be really cool if you sounded off in the comments regarding a couple different things. Number one, do you still think the SD Quattro is right for you? And number two, is your style of shooting conducive to using a bizarre camera like this? Before asking the questions about suitability, I need to talk about digital camera age. Foveon cameras tend to have a lot of staying power compared to others. Many people still swear by the mirror sensor, which is about 10 years old. Even though the Quattro is ancient by mirrorless camera standards, I think it is still very relevant. As are the mirror cameras due to its unique image rendering qualities, and it will be for a really long time. Also, a lot of cameras becoming outdated is due to market pressure. Despite what Sony or Canon want you to think, many older cameras are still viable today. They just want you to buy things. So they do what they can to make you think that your A7 II is terribly outdated, when it's not. Some of these questions are going to be pretty specific, like the first one. Number one, are you used to the limitations of shooting film, and are you willing to put up with some exaggerated digital analogs? Being a digital camera, a lot of inconveniences faced with shooting film are non-existent. Obviously, you don't have to change out a roll. A 64GB SD card will hold around 600 DNGs, a lot more than a roll of film, and there is no need to scan or pay someone to process negatives or any of that, no waiting. You also don't have those expensive disposable lithium batteries that we had in the 90s. But if you want peak performance out of the SD Quattro, it pays to act like it's a film camera. One that can only be loaded with ISO 100 film, since base ISO is the only setting that takes full advantage of that sensor. Reviewers generally agree that it is okay up to ISO 400, but I have found that if you were going over base ISO with this thing, you would be better served using a more appropriate tool, which is why the Quattro is a good second camera, rather than your primary day-to-day one. Instead of negatives taking up a drawer or shelf space or box space, The DNG RAW files that you are most likely to use are huge and can quickly fill up your hard drive. This gave me another incentive to add another step to my workflow that I didn't really have to bother with my XE1 or the Alpha 65. It pays to sort and delete things I don't need rather than just hitting import. The space requirements are so much higher, I'd rather do that than buy more hard drives, which also fail over time. Granted, doing that anyway leads to a cleaner work environment and lets me work faster in the long run, so that's a win. But it also changed the way I shoot. I became much more conservative, as I was when I paid for literally every shot shooting film. While some people were returning to their hotel rooms and anime conventions with 600 plus shots, I may have had 50, but my keeper rate was also incredibly high. The reasoning for this bled into the next thing I have to ask. Number 2, do you need autofocus all the time? And are you willing to do everything or learn to do everything manually? Even with newer lenses, autofocus is somewhat unreliable. Fortunately, the focus peaking on the SDQ is very good and the displays are sharp. I use the AF when birding at 600mm while doing minor corrections manually, and the 50 to 100s autofocus is usually pretty acceptable. My 30mm kit lens, less so. Firmware updates for both lenses and the camera have helped tremendously over the years, but for more critical work, I have to manually focus everything because I just don't trust the SDQ's AF system. I shoot methodically, slow. The camera is not fast, so I slow myself down to its pace and it pays off. This is a deal breaker for most people, and where most will say they don't want to deal with it. And that's fine. I mean, everyone does things differently. The camera's slow, I'm slow, so it works for me. I'm not saying the camera is old point and shoot slow. It is still modern and decent, has a decent enough right buffer. I would say it's a little slower than an early Fuji X camera with slightly better AF speeds due to using a hybrid focusing system rather than just contrast detect. You can, of course, calibrate newer global vision lenses using a device that connects them to the computer via USB. This is an absolute chore and full of uncertainty since the camera isn't accurate enough to really give me much confidence that I'm making a good or bad difference when I'm calibrating, so I gave up on that. The device is still worth it if you have newer lenses though, since you can update their firmware and change certain operating parameters. If you're using Sigma lenses with a more reliable AF camera, like a Canon something or other or a Sony something, then it's definitely worth calibrating them. Or if your Sigma camera is actually more consistent than mine, then yeah, calibrate. And yes, I am using spot focus on the targets. Focusing is not the only thing that really needs to be done manually. Since the dynamic range of the sensor is quite poor, it pays to manually operate every other parameter and get everything as correct in the camera as possible, rather than relying on the camera to figure it out or hoping that the RAW file has enough information in post to fix it later, which segues to the next question. Do you enjoy post-processing, or do you want to learn post the hard way? Post-processing is almost always a must with this camera to squeeze out as much as possible, and honestly that's true of any. It will shoot JPEG, and I have accidentally discovered that in ideal conditions, the JPEGs look pretty good. Despite the poor dynamic range, you can do a lot with those massive 100 plus megabyte DNG RAW files, and honestly even more with the 50 plus megabyte X3F, but you have to spend time with them and learn what works and what doesn't, and apply that knowledge while shooting. This is really true of any camera. I mean, it's just learning your equipment, but Foveon cameras give even less leeway for mistakes. It is to the point where I switched over to Capture One from Lightroom and got very familiar with the software because Lightroom's capabilities were just too limited to stretch the files as hard as I wanted to, especially with color, as seen in this example, like with the bricks. This isn't to say Lightroom user can't get that much out of the camera, they definitely can, especially when combining it with Photoshop. I've just found the Capture One to be a better tool. It's more of a one-stop shop solution, and I really wish that Sigma had kind of pulled a Fuji and established a relationship with Phase 1 to transition away from the antiquated Sigma Photo Pro. Sigma Photo Pro isn't as bad as it used to be. If you have a decent modern PC, the software is very usable, and files exported from it look exceptional. But it is still a chore and no longer absolutely required. So most people will go from the 14-bit X3F down to the 12-bit DNG and skip using it altogether at the expense of a little bit of quality and doubling the raw file size. If you have Photoshop, there's a plugin made by Sigma that lets you use Adobe Camera Raw for the X3Fs. It's a cumbersome process, but it actually works alongside settings you made in SPP, including lens correction and X3F fill light, which is pretty nice. This isn't to say if you get everything right in the camera, you won't end up with plenty of images that need very little adjustment. As with anything, as you get better with it, you'll need to do less in post. But you'll start seeing more and more granular details that bother you that you want to fix. And I don't think this is a bad thing. It's just attention to detail. I can say that shooting with the SD Quattro has helped with my attention to detail and has raised my standards in my own photography. Really quick note, Adobe GNG Converter does not convert the X3F files from the Quattro, unfortunately. Number 4. Are you okay with lugging something around that's much larger than other mirrorless cameras out there? Going to a totally different topic, the SD Quattro is big, and it uses SLR lenses, meaning the distance from the rear element to the sensor needs to be very long, creating a lot of dead space in the camera. This did leave room for Sigma's seriously smart removable IR filter / dust cover, and many will like the fact that there's just more to hold on to. It's more like carrying around a DSLR rather than a typical mirrorless camera, although it intrinsically is more durable due to having less moving parts. Number 5. Are you okay with a dead lens system and no upgrade path? With Sigma's SLR art primes, I don't really think there is a need for an upgrade path. If you have the 85 1.4 art for portraits, I mean, especially this being an APS-C camera, there's really no need to upgrade that for the life of the camera. The 18 to 35 f1.8 and the 50 to 100 f1.8 zooms are probably the most any Quattro shooter would ever really need. And I find that the 50 to 100 fully takes advantage of the sensor. It's kind of hard to have gas or gear acquisition syndrome when you already have the best you can get for the system and there won't be any better. An important note though, although Sigma's SA mount has been around for decades, the SD Quattro has a lens compatibility list, and only newer lenses in the Global Vision line are on it. This list doesn't mean very old lenses like the 50mm f2.8 macro or the awful film era kit zooms won't function on it. It means that the autofocus will be even less reliable. In my testing, it isn't as bad with early HSM hypersonic motor lenses like the 180 f3.5, but those using micromotors are basically manual focus only when considering speed and accuracy. To sum it up, the primary audience for this camera is the person who doesn't want to or can't spend the money to go medium format, but wants insane micro contrast and amazing color reproduction and is willing to work around practically everything else. Someone who wants the unique Foveon look and will throw almost everything else out the window to get it. This camera is also excellent for a sort of photo minimalist, somebody that doesn't want extra functions on the camera that no one buying something like this would use, like a full auto mode or scene modes, etc. If you're coming from film and are used to shooting film and enjoy it, the SD Quattro will feel really good and would make a great tool for you. Just treat it like you would your film camera. Learn the new ways of processing the images versus what you did with your film and keep a similar mindset. I think this is the primary audience for this camera and who it should have been marketed to. I personally fit into this category. If you shot or shoot Fujifilm Super CCD DSLRs or are a Fuji X shooter, I think the Quattro would be a good addition to your kit. You are probably used to the better color reproduction versus typical cameras with bare sensors. So I'd say keep using your Fuji gear for general purpose, and the Quattro would be great for planned shoots where you're in full control of the lighting, the subject, etc. I would also recommend someone used to images from, say, a Ricoh GR to look into this, since image quality is probably an absolute main concern, although if they want to maintain portability, I'd recommend comparing the SD Quattro with the DP Quattro series. If you are coming from Sony, Canon, Nikon, Pentax, or another camera based around bare filtered sensors and can't live without modern conveniences or high camera performance outside of image quality, the Quattro could be a good thing in getting you to slow down or it could sit on the shelf. Probably the latter. It does not perform as well as any modern camera from any of these companies, save for image quality. If you shoot fast action or in low light situations a lot and require any sort of usable above base ISO performance, this thing is not for you. You would be better served to find practically anything else. On this, if you primarily shoot street, I'd recommend looking elsewhere as well, as the SD Quattro is some bulky kit and you would probably want the AF performance. Some people actually do use the DP Quattros for street photography very successfully though, so look into that. If you are looking for a family camera, just to get some better photos of the kids, the cat, whatever, this thing's not for you at all. It will be a source of endless frustration. For this, I recommend a large sensor compact or a Sony a6000 or something along those lines, or a Micro Four Thirds camera. If you just want an upgrade from your phone that isn't that expensive, many recent compacts can take care of you too. If you are new to photography as a hobby and are looking for your first camera, this could be an interesting choice, great or terrible depending on your mindset. It will give you massive limitations but also gargantuan rewards for learning to use it. I would say if you're truly serious about learning photography and are passionate about portraiture or other slower things and don't want to deal with film, go for it. Although you're going to want a secondary, more general purpose camera as well because, right tool for the right job. For that secondary camera, I would recommend Fuji X System wholeheartedly. Old one, new one, just look into them, they're great. Or something along the lines of an A6000-ish thing, if video will also be a priority, although the newer Fuji X cameras do video extremely well. For this person, the Quattro also has the unique value proposition of not really having an upgrade path either with lenses or bodies. It will remain relevant for the foreseeable future and is not just appropriate but was designed for professional use. This saves money in the long run if the person wants to continue pursuing photography as a hobby or even a career. If they don't, the person will either be stuck with it or have to sell it at a sharp discount if they want to offload it quickly, as the Quattro doesn't have much of a market. Foveon diehards are borderline rabid, but we are very few, and we likely already have one or a Merrill camera and don't want the Quattro. Personally, I like both, but that's beside the point. So, if you think after all that the SD Quattro is the right camera for you, let me know in the comments below. If you thought it was, but are now having second thoughts, I'd like to hear about that too. I'd also love to hear about where you're coming from and what has worked for you in the past, etc. I'll try to respond as well. If you made it this far, thanks for listening. I've created a Discord channel mostly centered around showing off your work with weird and or old cameras and critique, so if you want to do that, the link is in the description below. Right now, there is one member, and that is me, but hopefully, over time, it can grow. So thank you for watching, and have a good night.